The late afternoon sun was dipping low behind the tall glass buildings of the city when she stepped out of her black car and looked up at the bank branch. It had been a long day for her. Meetings, calls, decisions, and responsibilities had taken most of her energy, but she carried herself with the same grace and quiet authority she always did. People in the city knew her as one of the youngest and most successful CEOs in the business world. She was the kind of leader who had built her company from the ground up, starting from a small office with just a few people and now leading a team of hundreds. Her name carried weight in corporate circles, but she was never the type to flaunt it. To her, leadership was not about showing power but about earning respect. She had chosen this particular branch of the bank because it was closest to her office. It was not her first time visiting, though most of her financial transactions were usually handled by her personal assistant. Today, however, she needed to withdraw a large sum herself. She preferred to take care of certain matters personally, especially when it involved her company's major projects. The branch had always looked modern and neat from the outside. Its wide glass doors gave a welcoming feeling, and people were walking in and out as she approached. As she entered, the cool air from the air conditioning brushed against her skin. The lobby was bright, with shining marble floors reflecting the overhead lights. A few customers sat in chairs, waiting for their turn, while others stood in line at the counters. Bank employees moved about quickly, some smiling politely at the clients they were assisting. Everything looked like an ordinary day at the bank. She walked toward the counter with the same confidence she carried into her boardroom. She wore a tailored business suit that fit her perfectly, her natural curls pulled back neatly, and in her hand was her leather folder containing all the documents she needed. To anyone watching, she looked like what she truly was, an accomplished professional. Yet, as she stood in line, she noticed small details in the atmosphere. The teller behind the glass counter seemed cheerful when greeting a man in front of her, but when her turn came, the teller's smile faded slightly. Still, she didn't pay much attention to it. She had long grown used to the different ways people looked at her. Sometimes it was admiration, sometimes surprise, and occasionally doubt. It no longer bothered her. She stepped up and greeted the teller politely, explaining that she wanted to make a withdrawal from the business account. The teller asked for her identification, and she handed over her driver's license, the company account card, and the authorization papers she always carried. The teller glanced at the documents and then looked over to the side where the branch manager was standing. The manager, a middle-aged man with a sharp suit and a stern expression, walked over slowly, glancing at her with eyes that carried more suspicion than professionalism. "What is it you want to do?" the manager asked flatly, his voice lacking the courtesy he had used when speaking to another customer just moments before. She repeated her request calmly. She explained the amount she needed and even provided extra paperwork showing her authority over the account. The manager studied her papers briefly, then placed them on the counter as if they were not enough. His lips tightened, and his tone grew firmer. "This is a very large transaction," he said. "We'll need to take additional steps before we can process this. Do you even have proper authorization for this account?" She blinked, a little surprised at the question. Not only had she given him proof of her identity, but her name was clearly visible on the account itself as the primary holder. She explained this again, pointing to the documents. Instead of responding with efficiency or professionalism, the manager gave her a doubtful look and shook his head. Behind her, a few people in line were beginning to whisper. Some tried not to stare, but it was hard to ignore the tension forming at the counter. She stood tall, refusing to let the change in atmosphere disturb her. She had learned, throughout her life, that remaining calm in uncomfortable situations often revealed more about others than about herself. The manager's voice grew louder as he insisted he could not move forward without what he called further verification. His words, however, carried no real justification. He was not asking her questions out of genuine concern for the bank's safety. It was clear in his tone and in his eyes he simply did not believe her. She could have argued. She could have raised her voice to match his. But that was never her way. She looked at him with the same steady expression she used when listening to employees in her own office. Inside, however, she could feel a quiet sting. It was not about the money. It was not even about the inconvenience. It was about the way he dismissed her presence as if she were undeserving of the same trust he had given to others without hesitation. The minutes ticked by slowly, though to her it felt like a test of patience. Every second she stood there, the sense of unfairness in the room grew heavier. The other customers waiting nearby looked on with curiosity, some with sympathy, and others with confusion. One older woman sitting in the waiting area leaned forward as if she wanted to say something but held back. The CEO adjusted the folder in her hand and reminded herself to remain composed. She thought of the countless times she had faced obstacles larger than this. She thought of the early days when banks had once refused her business loan applications simply because they doubted she could run a company. She remembered the countless no's she had turned into yes through perseverance. Compared to all of that, this moment was small, but it carried the same sting of being underestimated. She stood silently, allowing the manager to continue his unnecessary questioning, while she observed him carefully. Every word he spoke, every dismissive glance, was being noted in her mind. She knew she had the power to end this moment, but she wanted to see how far he would go. Outside the tall windows of the bank, cars passed on the street, their horns faint in the distance. Inside, the lobby felt still, as if everyone was waiting for what would happen next. The manager leaned closer, repeating again that he could not process her request. His voice, though not loud, carried enough weight for those nearby to hear. In that moment, she felt the balance of the situation shift inside her. She had walked into the bank simply to carry out a routine transaction, but it had already turned into something else, something that would test not just her patience but her authority. She did not know it yet, but within minutes the entire room would understand who she really was, and the same man who doubted her would face a consequence he never expected. And yet, she remained calm, her eyes steady on the manager, her voice soft but firm as she prepared her next words. The story was only just beginning. The pause between her words and the manager's response felt like a wall. She had made herself clear, but his expression did not soften. Instead, his lips pressed into a thin line, and his eyes narrowed as though he was searching for something in her face that did not exist. The documents she had handed over still lay on the counter, untouched, as if they carried no weight. He leaned back slightly, crossing his arms, a gesture that carried more doubt than professionalism. "I'm sorry," he said at last, his tone colder than before. "But this transaction cannot move forward until we take more steps to confirm your authority. Withdrawals of this size are not something we allow just anyone to make." She remained composed, her posture straight and dignified. She could feel the quiet stir behind her. Several people in line shuffled uncomfortably, while others pretended to busy themselves with their phones, though their ears were clearly tuned to every word. A young man in a gray jacket muttered something under his breath, shaking his head slightly, while the older woman in the waiting area sighed in frustration. The CEO gently pointed to her identification again, her voice calm. "You have my driver's license. You have the company account card. My name is on the account itself. These documents are not just valid, they are official. Please check them properly." But instead of acknowledging her words, the manager gave a small, dismissive laugh, not loud enough to seem unprofessional but clear enough to sting. "I'm not sure you understand how this works. We can't just hand over this amount to someone who says they're in charge. Anyone can bring papers. We need more than that." The way he said anyone carried a weight that made her chest tighten. She knew that word was not chosen by accident. It was a word used when people wanted to strip someone of individuality, when they wanted to make a person invisible in their own right. She let out a quiet breath and straightened the folder in her hands again. Every fiber in her body told her to respond sharply, to remind him exactly who he was speaking to. But her years of leadership had taught her something greater. Patience often revealed more than anger ever could. So, she stood there with a steady face, allowing him to continue. The teller who had first greeted her looked uneasy. Her eyes moved back and forth between the manager and the CEO as though she was silently hoping the situation would resolve. But the manager, confident in his authority, stepped closer to the glass partition. "If you'd like, you can come back another day with additional verification. Until then, I'm afraid there's nothing we can do." She felt the words press against her like a locked door. Come back another day. Additional verification. Nothing we can do. All of it was unnecessary. All of it was untrue. Behind her, the whispers grew louder. A man at the back of the line leaned over to another and asked quietly, "Why won't they just check her ID? That looks official to me." The other shrugged but kept watching. A young woman near the front adjusted her bag nervously, glancing between the two, sensing the unfairness of it all. The CEO's thoughts wandered briefly to all the times she had heard "come back another day" in her life. She remembered being young, walking into offices with proposals and being told to return later, as though her time had no value. She remembered investors who brushed her aside, doubting she could handle the weight of responsibility. But every "come back another day" had only pushed her harder, made her stronger, and now here she was the owner of one of the most successful companies the city had seen in years. And yet, she stood here in a bank lobby, her legitimacy questioned by someone who should have been offering respect. The manager's voice cut through her thoughts. "Perhaps if you bring someone else from your company, someone with higher clearance, we could move forward." She tilted her head slightly, the smallest hint of a smile forming at the edge of her lips. It was not a smile of amusement but of quiet disbelief. Higher clearance. She was the highest authority her company had. There was no one above her, no one else to call. She was the final decision maker. And yet, the man standing across from her could not, or would not, see it. Her calm reply came with steady precision. "There is no higher clearance. I am the CEO. This account belongs to my company, and I am the account holder. Everything you need is in front of you." The room grew even quieter. The sound of the printer spitting out paper at another desk echoed in the silence, a strange reminder of the ordinary tasks still going on around this extraordinary scene. The manager's face tightened, and instead of acknowledging her words, he leaned back again, as though she had said nothing at all. The sting of the situation spread through her, not in anger but in disappointment. She thought about the countless seminars and talks she had given on leadership, equality, and respect. She thought about the young people who looked up to her, who saw her as proof that success was possible regardless of background. And here she was, facing a moment that showed how quickly some people could choose prejudice over professionalism. She noticed the way the other employees shifted uncomfortably at their desks, their eyes flickering toward the counter but quickly darting away again. They knew something was wrong, but none of them had the courage to step in, not yet. The teller looked down at her hands nervously, clearly unsure of what to do. The manager tapped the documents lightly with his fingers as if dismissing them completely. "I'm sorry, but rules are rules," he said, his tone final, his expression unreadable. Rules. She almost wanted to laugh at the word. She had spent her life following rules, breaking barriers, and even creating new standards in her industry. And here was a man, using rules not as a guide for fairness but as a shield for his own doubts. She let the silence linger for a moment longer, her eyes locked on his. Behind her, the whispers had turned into a quiet tension that filled the air. It was no longer just her moment, it was everyone's. Every person in that lobby was witnessing something unfair, something that would not be forgotten. She took a slow breath, her voice still calm but carrying a new weight. "If you choose not to move forward, That is your decision. But remember, decisions carry consequences. Not just for me, for you as well. The words hung in the air, steady and sure, carrying more authority than the manager could ever have imagined. He blinked, unsure how to respond, his confidence flickering for the first time. In that moment, the story had shifted. What had begun as a simple withdrawal had now turned into something else entirely, a test of patience, dignity, and authority. The lobby, the customers, the employees, all of them were watching, waiting, sensing that what would happen next would change everything. And as she stood there, calm and unshaken, she already knew that within a few minutes, the balance of power in that room would shift forever. The tension inside the bank felt like a storm waiting to break. The CEO stood still, her documents resting on the counter, while the manager kept insisting that nothing could be done. The hum of the air conditioning and the faint beeping of machines in the background did little to soften the uncomfortable silence. Customers shifted in their seats, torn between curiosity and discomfort. The entire lobby seemed to hold its breath. She could feel the weight of every glance on her. It was not unusual for her to be watched. After all, she was used to giving speeches, leading meetings, and standing before rooms filled with important people. But this was different. Here, the stares were not of admiration but of disbelief, and she knew they were directed not at her words but at the way she was being treated. She drew in a slow breath and reminded herself of the lessons life had taught her. She knew that anger would only cloud the moment. Calmness was her armor, and patience was her strength. Still, even with her steady composure, she could not ignore the quiet sting in her chest as the manager's words replayed in her mind. The manager tapped the edge of the counter again, his tone sharp. "We cannot process this. If you continue insisting, we will have to ask you to step aside so other customers can be served." Step aside. Those two words hit harder than all the others. He was not just denying her request, he was pushing her presence out of the way, dismissing her authority as though she were no more than an interruption. She stood firmly, her gaze unwavering. "I am not stepping aside," she replied in a calm but steady voice. "I have every right to access this account, and I will not leave until I receive the service that any client deserves." The firmness in her voice carried across the room. A young man near the back of the line muttered, "Good for her," while a woman beside him nodded silently. The older woman in the waiting area shook her head in disapproval, not at the CEO, but at the way the manager was behaving. For the first time, the manager looked slightly unsettled. He was used to clients lowering their voices, complying quickly, or walking away in frustration. But this woman in front of him showed none of those signs. Her tone was polite but unshakable, her stance dignified, and her eyes filled with quiet determination. Still, he held his ground. "I have the authority in this branch," he said with stiff pride. "And I say this transaction is not approved." Her heart beat calmly as she studied him. She did not need to argue loudly, because the truth was already on her side. Instead, she let the silence linger, allowing everyone in the lobby to absorb his words. "Authority," he had said. He believed the little power he held inside this branch outweighed the truth of who she was. Then, almost like a twist of fate, the glass doors of the bank opened, and a new figure stepped in. It was one of the bank's senior employees, someone who often worked with her company's accounts. The employee, a woman in her early 40s, carried a stack of files in her arms and looked exhausted from the long day. She walked in briskly but stopped the moment her eyes landed on the scene at the counter. Her face brightened instantly. "Miss Williams," she exclaimed warmly, using the CEO's name. She quickly placed the files on a desk and hurried over. Her genuine smile and enthusiastic greeting filled the room with a wave of recognition that was impossible to ignore. The customers who had been whispering fell silent, their eyes widening. The teller behind the counter blinked in surprise, and even the manager froze, his confidence faltering. The CEO turned her head gently toward the familiar voice and returned the smile with calm grace. "It's good to see you," the employee said sincerely. "I didn't know you'd be visiting this branch today." The warmth in her tone stood in sharp contrast to the coldness of the manager just moments before. The difference was so striking that even those waiting nearby could sense it. The manager's face shifted uneasily. He glanced between the CEO and the employee, trying to gather himself. You know her?" he asked hesitantly. "Know her?" The employee almost laughed in disbelief. "She's not just a client, she's the CEO of the company that holds one of the largest accounts in this bank. She's the reason half of us even have the business we do." "Of course I know her." The words echoed through the lobby like a bell ringing at the end of silence. Every customer who had been watching now understood the full weight of the situation. The whispers turned into gasps, and a few people exchanged knowing looks. The CEO, however, did not gloat. She remained as calm as she had been from the start. She allowed the truth to unfold naturally, letting the manager's own disbelief become his lesson. She had no need to raise her voice, her presence spoke louder than any words could. The manager's face paled slightly. His hands, once confidently resting on the counter, now fidgeted awkwardly. He opened his mouth as if to speak but closed it again, realizing there was nothing he could say that would excuse his behavior. The employee, still smiling warmly at the CEO, turned toward the teller. "Please process her transaction immediately. There should be no delay. Everything is in order." The teller nodded quickly, relieved to finally move things along. She reached for the documents with careful hands, as though handling something precious, and began typing into her system. The manager took a small step back, his earlier confidence crumbling. The authority he had boasted of now seemed small and powerless in the face of the truth. Around the lobby, customers exchanged looks of quiet satisfaction. Some smiled discreetly, as though they were grateful to see justice being served before their eyes. The CEO simply stood there, poised and serene, watching everything unfold. She had not needed to argue or shout, all she had done was remain patient, and the truth had revealed itself at the right moment. But deep inside, she also knew this was no small matter. This was not just about one transaction or one mistaken judgment. It was about how easily someone in authority could let prejudice cloud their responsibility. She kept her thoughts to herself for the moment, but she was already considering what her next steps would be. The lobby had turned from cold silence into buzzing whispers again, only this time the whispers were filled with recognition of her identity. The power balance had shifted entirely, and the man who had once tried to dismiss her now stood in the shadow of his own mistake. And as she waited for the teller to finish, her mind was steady. She knew that in a few more minutes, she would not just withdraw money from this branch, she would withdraw the very authority of the man who had tried to humiliate her. The storm was far from over. The room felt different now. Only a few minutes earlier, the air had been thick with tension, but now it carried a new kind of energy. The whispers in the lobby had shifted, no longer about doubt or confusion but about recognition and quiet admiration. The teller's hands moved quickly over the keyboard, processing the transaction with focus and care, while the senior employee remained nearby, speaking warmly to the CEO about her company and their long-standing partnership with the bank. Through it all, the CEO stood steady. Her presence was calm, almost serene, but her mind was sharp. Every detail of what had happened replayed in her thoughts: the hesitation, the disbelief, the way the manager had dismissed her documents as if they were meaningless. She had expected efficiency and professionalism, but instead she had been forced to wait, judged not by her qualifications but by assumptions. The manager lingered near the counter, silent now. His earlier confidence had drained away, leaving only nervous glances and fidgeting hands. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, as though searching for a way out of the moment. But there was none. His words had already been heard, his attitude already revealed. Nothing he said now could erase what had unfolded in front of an entire lobby of witnesses. The senior employee noticed the discomfort in the room and spoke softly to the CEO. "I'm so sorry you had to experience this," she said, her voice carrying both respect and regret. "This is not the service you deserve, and certainly not what this bank stands for. Please allow me to make this right." The CEO gave her a small nod of appreciation. "Thank you," she said gently. Her tone was calm, but her eyes were firm. "But this is not just about me. It's about how easily people can be treated unfairly. If this is how I was spoken to, imagine how others might be treated when they don't have the means to defend themselves." Her words carried weight, and the senior employee lowered her eyes briefly, knowing the truth in them. A few customers nearby exchanged thoughtful looks, realizing that they had just witnessed more than a simple misunderstanding. It was a moment that reflected something deeper. The teller finished processing the transaction and slid the necessary papers and receipts back toward the CEO with careful hands. "It's all ready for you," she said softly, almost as if offering an apology with her tone. The CEO accepted the papers gracefully, slipping them into her folder. She could have ended the moment there. She could have taken her money, walked out the glass doors, and left the branch behind. But her instincts told her otherwise. Leadership was not only about achieving goals, it was about accountability. If she simply walked away, the same manager might repeat his actions with someone else tomorrow. She turned slowly toward the manager, who stiffened under her gaze. For the first time since she had entered, the authority in the room was not his. The balance had shifted entirely, and he seemed to feel it pressing down on him. "Tell me," she said in a measured voice, "was it truly the rules that held you back, or was it something else?" The question hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. The manager opened his mouth but no words came out. He looked around, perhaps hoping for support from his staff, but none of them met his eyes. The employees kept their heads down, typing at their computers or shuffling papers, unwilling to stand by him. The CEO did not need his answer, his silence spoke clearly. She let the moment linger long enough for everyone in the lobby to see. Then she said softly but firmly, "I came here today expecting service. Instead, I was doubted, delayed, and disrespected. That is not acceptable." Her voice was not raised, but it carried through the entire lobby with strength. Customers straightened in their chairs, employees froze mid-task, and the manager's face turned pale. The senior employee stepped forward carefully. "Miss Williams," she said with concern, "would you like me to file a formal report about this? I assure you, we will take immediate action from the main office." The CEO looked at her thoughtfully, then shook her head slowly. "No," she replied. "This is not something that needs to be sent away to be handled later. It will be addressed here and now." Her words sent a ripple through the room. The customers looked at one another in quiet surprise. The employees sat up straighter, sensing that something important was about to happen. Even the teller glanced nervously at the manager, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the papers on her desk. The CEO took a step closer to the counter, her voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "This bank does not belong to you alone," she said to the manager. "It serves hundreds of people every day, people who deserve respect, fairness, and professionalism. You chose to let your assumptions cloud your duty. You failed to see me as a client, as a leader, as a person deserving of service. That choice has consequences." The manager swallowed hard, his face tense, but he remained silent. The CEO continued, her words deliberate. "If I allow this behavior to go unchecked, it will continue. And I will not allow that. For the good of this branch, for the good of this bank, and for the good of the people who trust it, you can no longer serve as its leader." The lobby went silent. The words seemed to echo against the marble walls. The manager blinked, disbelief flashing in his eyes. You can't," he began, but the senior employee quickly interrupted, her voice respectful but firm. "She can," the employee said. and she has every authority to do so. This account is one of the most significant in our bank. If Miss Williams says your position is no longer valid, then it is not." Gasps rippled through the customers. Some leaned forward, others exchanged wide-eyed glances. The manager's mouth opened again as if to protest, but his words dissolved under the weight of the truth. He stepped back slowly, his pride broken, his authority stripped in front of everyone. The CEO remained calm. There was no anger in her face, only resolve. She had not raised her voice, she had not humiliated him with insults. She had simply held him accountable, the way any true leader would. The senior employee nodded quickly and gestured for two staff members to escort the manager away from the counter. He resisted only slightly, his shoulders slumped as he realized there was nothing more he could do. The employees guided him toward the back offices, and the glass doors soon closed behind him. The lobby felt lighter, almost as though the air itself had shifted. A few customers began clapping softly, the sound hesitant at first but growing as others joined in. The applause was not loud or chaotic, it was respectful, a quiet acknowledgement of what had just taken place. The CEO raised a hand gently, and the clapping stopped. "Thank you," she said to the room, her voice kind. "But this was not about me alone. This was about respect, something every person here deserves. Remember that." With that, she gathered her folder, thanked the teller and the senior employee, and turned toward the glass doors. Her steps were steady, her posture proud, as she walked out into the evening light. Behind her, the bank lobby remained filled with a silence that carried not discomfort anymore, but reflection. And though the incident had lasted only minutes, it left an impression that none of them would forget. As she stepped out of the bank, the evening sky had deepened into a soft shade of gold and orange. The city was alive with its usual rhythm, cars rushing by, people walking with hurried steps, shop lights flickering to life one by one. Yet, for her, the world felt strangely still. What had just taken place inside the glass doors behind her was more than a personal encounter. It was a moment that spoke about leadership, dignity, and the responsibility that comes with both. She walked slowly toward her car, her leather folder tucked neatly under her arm. Her driver hurried forward to open the door for her, but she paused for a moment, turning to glance back at the building. Through the glass, she could still see customers whispering among themselves and employees moving cautiously, as though adjusting to the sudden change in their branch. She knew the story of what had happened would not remain confined to those walls. Word would travel quickly inside the bank's network, through the city, and perhaps even further. Inside the car, the quiet offered her a chance to reflect. She leaned back in the seat and closed her eyes for a brief moment, replaying the manager's face, the disbelief in his voice, the way he had tried to push her aside. She thought of the silence that had filled the lobby when she spoke, and the ripple of recognition when the senior employee had revealed her identity. It was not pride she felt, but a deep sense of responsibility. She knew very well that she could have ignored the entire moment, taken her money, walked away, and moved on with her life. But to her, leadership was not about convenience. It was about choosing the harder path when it mattered, about making decisions that left a lasting mark. Removing the manager was not about revenge. It was about accountability. If someone in his position could treat her that way, what hope was there for others, those without influence, without titles, without the voice to defend themselves? Her phone buzzed softly in her bag. She reached for it and saw a message from the senior employee who had stood by her in the bank. "Thank you for addressing this immediately. The staff here will never forget what happened today. It has opened everyone's eyes." She smiled faintly, typing back a short reply, "It wasn't about me. It was about respect. Always." The car moved smoothly through the city streets, the reflections of street lights gliding across the windows. She thought of the young people in her company, the interns, the new graduates, the ones who looked up to her as proof that success was possible. Many of them carried the same doubts she once had, the same fears of not being taken seriously, of being overlooked. She knew that the story of this day, once shared, would serve as a reminder that standing tall, even in uncomfortable situations, could change everything. Her mind drifted back to her early days when she had walked into her first bank as a young entrepreneur, armed with nothing but a business plan and determination. She remembered the way she had been dismissed then, the way her dreams had been doubted. It was almost poetic that now, years later, in a bank again, she had faced the same disbelief, only this time she had the strength and authority to respond differently. The car slowed as it approached her home, a place of peace after long days. She stepped out, greeting the staff at the gate warmly, and walked up the path lined with lights. Inside, the quiet of her living room welcomed her. She set her folder on the table and sat by the large window, watching the sky darken fully into night. She thought of the manager again. She did not feel anger toward him anymore. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of resolve. Perhaps this moment would serve as a lesson for him too, a chance to reflect, to recognize how deeply words and attitudes could hurt, and maybe even to change. Sometimes the hardest lessons were the ones that shaped people for the better. As the night grew deeper, she poured herself a cup of tea and sat with her thoughts. She imagined the conversations happening back at the bank. Employees likely discussing how quickly the situation had shifted, customers telling friends and family what they had witnessed, the head office already preparing to address the incident. She knew her name would be mentioned often in the coming days, not just as a client but as a leader who demanded fairness. But she also knew this was not about her alone. It was about the countless others who had faced similar treatment but walked away silently. It was about reminding everyone that respect is not earned by appearance, assumptions, or prejudice. It is something every human being deserves. Later that week, she received a formal letter from the bank's headquarters. The letter carried words of apology, acknowledging what had happened and promising stronger training for staff to ensure that no client would ever be treated in such a way again. She read it carefully, nodding slightly, but she knew actions would matter more than words. The real test would be in how the bank chose to move forward, how it chose to rebuild trust with every person who walked through its doors. When she arrived at her office the following Monday, her team was already buzzing with news of what had happened. A few had read about it online, others had heard from contacts in the financial world. Her assistant approached her cautiously, holding a newspaper article that highlighted the story. The headline read, "CEO takes stand against unfair treatment, manager removed after 7 minutes of disrespect." She looked at the article briefly, then placed it aside. She didn't need recognition from the press. She hadn't acted for attention. She had acted because it was the right thing to do. Her team, however, looked at her with new admiration. For them, it wasn't just another story. It was proof of the values she carried into every decision, values that shaped not only her company but her leadership as a whole. In the days that followed, the story continued to spread. People in different industries discussed it in meetings and conferences. Some praised her decisiveness, others admired her calmness under pressure. For young professionals, especially those who often felt underestimated, it became a symbol of courage and dignity. She remained the same through it all, focused, steady, and humble. She did not let the attention distract her, nor did she let the moment define her. It was simply one more example of the principle she lived by: true leadership is not about power, but about responsibility. One evening, weeks later, she found herself driving past the same bank branch. The lights inside glowed warmly, and through the glass she could see customers being helped with smiles and efficiency. She wondered briefly about the former manager, where he was now, what he might have learned. She hoped the experience had left him with reflection rather than bitterness, with growth rather than resentment. As the car drove on, she turned her gaze forward. There were new meetings ahead, new projects to lead, new challenges waiting. But she carried the memory of that day with her, not as a wound, but as a reminder of the importance of standing firm, of holding others accountable, and of never letting silence excuse injustice. The incident had lasted only 7 minutes, but its echo would last far longer. It was proof that sometimes, in the span of just a few minutes, a leader could change not only a single moment but the culture around it. And that was something she would continue to live by, wherever life took her next.